Most people, when they find out badly. A phone left face up on a counter. A notification that wasn't meant for them. A friend who finally couldn't hold it anymore and said the thing they'd been sitting on for months. The discovery arrives uninvited and it arrives all at once, and there's no time to prepare for it, no space to decide how you want to receive it, no version of the moment where you get to choose anything at all. It just lands. And then you're in it. Diane found out on a Monday. She'd taken the day off work. Nothing significant. Just a personal day she'd had sitting and used since February, and her manager had started asking about it. She was home alone. Marcus was at the office, or said he was. She was doing the kind of nothing you do when you suddenly have a day with no obligations. Moving from room to room, drinking coffee that went cold, halfway reading something she kept putting down. The apartment was quiet in the specific way apartments are quiet when only one person is in them. She wasn't looking for anything. That's the part she came back to later, more than once, because there's a version of this story where she was suspicious, where something had been nagging at her and she'd followed the thread deliberately. That wasn't what happened. She was just home on a Monday, doing nothing, and the thing found her. She was looking for a document. A lease renewal from 2 years ago that she needed a number from for a form she was filling out. It was in a shared folder they'd set up early in the relationship for things like that, apartment paperwork and tax documents and the receipts for the bigger things they'd bought together. She went into the folder. The lease wasn't in there. What was in there was a subfolder she didn't recognize, named with a string of numbers that meant nothing to her, the kind of name you give something when you don't want it to have a name. She almost didn't open it. She opened it. Inside were photographs. A few hundred of them, organized by date, going back almost 2 years. Not explicit. Just a life. A parallel life, documented with the same casualness as any relationship where two people take pictures because they're happy and want to remember it. Dinners. A weekend somewhere she didn't recognize. A birthday, someone's birthday, with a cake and candles and Marcus's face lit up the way faces get lit up by candlelight, and she knew that face, she knew every version of that face, and this was a version she recognized. She sat with the folder open for a long time. She was 33. They'd been together for 4 years. Engaged for 14 months. The wedding was scheduled for the following spring, venue booked, deposit paid, her dress already altered twice because she'd lost weight during the planning process in the way people sometimes lose weight when they're operating under a level of low-grade stress they've normalized so completely they've stopped calling it stress. She didn't cry. She noted that later, with some interest, that the first thing she felt wasn't grief or rage but something colder and more structural. Like a floor she'd been standing on had revealed itself to be glass, and the glass had cracked, and she was looking down through it at the drop below. The feeling wasn't falling. It was the moment before falling when you understand that falling is what's about to happen. She closed the laptop. She finished her coffee. She sat in the apartment for another hour and didn't do anything at all. Then she made a decision that would define the next 2 years of her life, and she made it quietly, almost without drama, the way she made most of her important decisions. Not from emotion, not from impulse, but from a clear-eyed assessment of where she was and what she actually needed. She decided not to tell him she knew. Not yet. Not until she understood what she was dealing with and what she wanted to do about it and what she needed to have in place before she did it. She closed the laptop, put it back where it had been, and when Marcus came home that evening she cooked dinner and they ate together and she asked him about his day and he told her about a meeting that had run long and she listened and nodded and the performance was so complete and so immediate that it scared her a little, how easy it was. Diane had grown up in a family that valued composure. Her mother was the kind of woman who could receive terrible news and process it entirely internally, holding her face exactly still while something irreversible happened behind it, and Diane had inherited that quality in the specific way children inherit things from the parent they most carefully watched. Not because they chose it, but because they absorbed it early enough that it became part of how they were built. She'd been told, growing up, that this composure was a gift. Later she'd been told, by therapists and friends and a boyfriend before Marcus who found it unnerving, that it was also a wall. That holding things that tightly had a cost. Both things were true. On a Monday in March, when she found a folder of photographs on a shared drive and decided to say nothing, it was the most useful thing about her. The first month was the information phase, though she didn't have a name for it then. She was just paying attention differently. The folder had given her the shape of the thing but not its dimensions. She didn't know how serious it was, how long it had really been going on, whether this was something that had peaked and was winding down or something still actively happening. She needed to know, not to hurt herself further, but because the answers would change what she decided to do. You can't navigate a situation you don't understand. What she found over those first weeks was that it was serious, ongoing. The woman's name was Claire. She existed at the intersection of Marcus's professional and social world in a way that would have been easy to explain away if Diane had been looking for explanations, which she wasn't. She was looking for the truth, and the truth was that this wasn't a mistake or a crisis or a temporary collapse of judgment. It was a relationship. It had its own history and texture and continuity, and it had been running parallel to their relationship for long enough that it had developed the quiet confidence of something that expects to keep existing. That information settled something in her. She'd wondered, in the first weeks, whether there was a version of this where she confronted him and they rebuilt. Whether the thing she'd found was a symptom of something that could be addressed, a gap between them that had allowed it that they could close. She looked at what she was actually dealing with and understood that there was no version of that. The rebuilding story required a specific kind of situation, a specific kind of person, a specific kind of mistake. This was neither. This was someone who had built something deliberate and sustained and who had been good enough at maintaining it that she'd had no idea, none, for almost 2 years. She wanted out. That became clear very quickly. What took longer to clarify was the shape of the exit. She had practical vulnerabilities she needed to address before she could move. They'd intertwined their finances more than she'd fully registered until she started looking carefully. A joint account they both pulled from for household things. A shared credit card. The lease in both their names with 8 months remaining. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing she couldn't untangle. But it required attention and it required time. She wasn't going to leave and then spend the next year dealing with the wreckage of a hasty exit. She started quietly. She opened a bank account she hadn't had before, at a different bank from her primary one, and began moving money into it in amounts small enough not to register. Not significant money. She had her own income, her own savings, nothing she took was anything but hers. But she started building a financial position that was entirely separate from him, a foundation that would be there when she needed it. She was not going to leave and be vulnerable. She'd watched women do that. Leave in a fury with nothing in place and spend the following months clawing back stability while also managing grief. And she had decided, with the same quietness with which she made all her decisions, that it wouldn't go that way for her. She also started thinking about where she wanted to live. She'd moved to the city for Marcus. It was his city, his network, his sense of how a life should be arranged, good neighborhood, good restaurant within walking distance, the kind of apartment building with a doorman that made him feel like he'd arrived somewhere. She'd built a life here, but it was built around a center that was now hollow, and when that center stopped existing, the life around it would need to be rebuilt anyway. She might as well rebuild it somewhere she'd actually chosen. She started researching cities. She did it carefully, using her work laptop rather than the shared home computer, searching during work hours when she was alone in her office. She wasn't afraid of Marcus exactly. He wasn't the kind of man who checked her search history. But she developed a discipline around the separation of the two versions of her life that she maintained without exception, because exceptions were how things unraveled. She had a short list within 3 months, then a single choice. She didn't tell anyone. The loneliness of year 1 was a specific texture she had trouble describing later. Not the loneliness of being alone. She was surrounded by people. More like the loneliness of being the only person in every room who knew what was actually happening. She'd go to dinner with friends, mutual friends, people who knew both of them and loved both of them and had been planning to be at the wedding in the spring, and they'd talk about Marcus and she'd talk about Marcus and she'd do it with the fluency of someone who wasn't carrying a secret the size of a building. She got good at it. Too good, maybe. The performance became so natural that there were moments when she'd come back to herself. Mid-laugh at something someone said, mid-conversation about the wedding venue, and feel the gap between the face she was wearing and the thing underneath it like a physical distance. She didn't let herself stay in those moments long. She had a project and the project needed her to function. Around 8 months in, she told one person, her sister, who lived in another city and had no connection to Marcus's world. She chose carefully. She needed one person who knew, one person she could call at 11 at night when the carrying became too much, and she needed that person to be completely outside the situation. Her sister listened for 2 hours and then said, "Are you okay?" And Diane said, "I will be." And her sister said, "What can I do?" And Diane said, "Exactly what you're already doing." And that was true. The being known by one person was what she'd needed, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully registered was tight. She made her sister promise to tell no one. Her sister kept the promise for the full duration. The second year was different from the first in ways she hadn't anticipated. The acute phase, the discovery, the shock, the urgent information gathering, had settled into something steadier and flatter. She knew what she was dealing with. She had a plan. She was executing it. The emotional texture of year 2 was less about pain and more about endurance, the specific quality of keeping going through something that required no new decisions, just the daily maintenance of a position she'd already taken. That was harder in some ways than the first year. The first year had an energy to it. Everything was new, everything mattered, there was a momentum to figuring it out. Year 2 was just the last stretch before the finish line, and last stretches require a different kind of fuel. She kept working. She was good at her job throughout both years, not just functional but genuinely good, doing work she was proud of, maintaining relationships with clients and colleagues that had nothing to do with the situation she was managing at home. She thinks now that the work saved her in some way that she didn't fully understand while it was happening. It was the place where she was entirely herself, where nothing was performed, where the problem didn't exist. She'd go to the office and spend 8 hours being exactly the person she was, and then come home and put the second layer back on, and she'd learned to make that transition without breaking stride. The decision about when came together in the second winter. She'd been thinking about timing for most of year 2. Not obsessively, but with the steady attention she brought to anything she needed to get right. She didn't want to catch him in something. She didn't need the dramatic revelation. What she wanted was a moment that was entirely on her terms, at a time of her choosing, when everything she'd been building was fully in place and she was ready to walk directly from the conversation into the next chapter without any of the scrambling that came from moving before you were ready. The timing she landed on was specific. Marcus had a work situation in the early spring that was consuming him. A deal that mattered to his year, to his sense of himself professionally, that was running into complications he hadn't predicted. He was distracted in a way she hadn't seen before, operating with less bandwidth than usual, less capacity for the kind of strategic conversation management he was actually quite good at. She'd watched him manage difficult conversations for 4 years. He was skilled at it. She wanted to have this conversation when he was less skilled than usual. She also had, by that spring, everything in place. She'd signed a lease in the city she'd chosen, signed it remotely, with the separate email address she'd been using for anything related to the move, transferred the deposit from the separate account. She had movers scheduled. She'd already moved most of what was specifically hers to a storage unit, quietly over the preceding 2 months. Her books, the things she'd brought into the apartment, the items that were unambiguously hers. She'd done it gradually enough that nothing looked different. The apartment had shifted incrementally and invisibly, from theirs to mostly his. She told 3 more friends in the 2 weeks before. Not the full 2 years. She gave them the essential shape of it, what had happened and what she was doing about it. Enough that they'd know when she called afterward. All 3 were stunned. Not by what Marcus had done, not exactly. People have a way of finding betrayal less surprising in retrospect than it was in the moment, because the retrospective version always comes with evidence that makes it feel inevitable. What stunned them was the duration of her silence. How long she'd been carrying it. How thoroughly she'd kept it from everyone. One of them asked if she was angry. She thought about it. She said she'd been angry for a long time in year 1, and then the anger had moved through and what it left behind was something harder to name. Not forgiveness. Not peace exactly. Something more like clarity. A very complete and settled understanding of who he was and what this situation was and what she was going to do about it. The anger had been part of how she got to that clarity. Once she had the clarity, she didn't need the anger anymore. The conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon. She'd asked him to go for a walk. Just a walk. She felt like getting outside. Nothing in the phrasing that would signal anything was different. He said sure and got his jacket, and they walked out of the building and down the block, and she let 2 minutes pass before she said what she'd come to say. She told him she knew about Claire. She told him she'd known for 2 years. She told him she wasn't there to fight about it or to hear an explanation or to give him the opportunity to manage the conversation. She was just telling him. She was out of the apartment in 10 days. A week after that, she was somewhere else entirely. In a city she'd chosen, in an apartment she'd signed for herself, with a life that was about to be entirely reconstructed from a foundation that was only hers. The first morning she woke up in the new apartment was a Tuesday. She lay in bed for a while and listened to the sounds of the new place. Traffic pattern different, light coming in from a different direction, the specific unfamiliarity of a space that hadn't become normal yet. She thought about the 2 years, not analyzing it, not processing it, just aware of it, aware of the distance she'd traveled and the shape of the path that had led here. She felt something she later described as relief so complete it was almost physical. Not because it was over, though it was, because she was only one person again. The two versions, the one who knew and was managing and was building, and the one who showed up to dinner and asked about his day, had collapsed back into each other, and she was just herself, singular, without the weight of the second layer she'd been carrying for 2 years. She got up and made coffee and looked out the window and started the day. The aftermath was quieter than she expected. Marcus reached out in the first week, calls, messages, the predictable pattern of someone who has just discovered that a situation they thought they controlled had resolved completely without their input. She read the messages without responding. She'd said what she had to say. There was nothing to add. What struck her about those messages was their tone. Not angry, confused. The confusion of someone who hadn't fully processed yet that there was no version of events where she came back, where they talked it through, where he got the chance to construct a narrative that made this manageable for him. She'd already closed that door before she opened the one on the walk. He was standing in front of a conversation that had already happened without him. She let the messages stop on their own, which they did within 2 weeks. She built the new city deliberately. She introduced herself to neighbors. She found a coffee shop. She established the small routines that make a place feel like somewhere rather than between somewheres. 6 weeks in, she ran into someone she'd known years before, someone who'd ended up in the same city by a different route, and that person became the thread she pulled to build a new network without having to construct it entirely from scratch. The network grew the way networks do when you're present and open to it. She thought about Marcus less than she expected to. Not because she'd resolved anything formally. She hadn't forgiven him, hadn't made peace with it in any ceremonial sense. He just stopped being the organizing center of anything she was paying attention to. He existed somewhere. That was essentially unrelated to her. What she thought about more, she told me, was the version of herself before. 31 years old, meeting this man, being careful in the way she was always careful, trusting in the measured and deliberate way that she thought was sufficient protection. She thought about that person with a tenderness that surprised her. She'd been so careful. She'd thought careful was enough. She knew now that careful about the right things was what mattered. Knowing what was yours. Knowing what your name was on. Having a financial position that belonged to you alone, not because you were cynical but because clarity about what you actually had was the thing that protected you when protection turned out to be necessary. She applied that going forward. Not as armor, she wasn't closed, but she was specific in ways she hadn't been before. She named things. She made the implicit explicit. She was comfortable with the slight awkwardness of asking a direct question because she'd learned the cost of leaving things assumed. About a year after the move, she was having dinner with her sister, the one who'd known and kept the secret, and her sister asked what she'd do differently if she could go back. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, seriously, without rushing to an answer. She said she'd tell someone sooner. Not about the plan, not about the logistics, just that something was wrong. Just so she wasn't carrying it alone for quite so long. Her sister nodded. She said she'd also let herself feel it more. There were months in year one where she was managing the situation so tightly, holding it so completely under control, that she wasn't letting herself feel how hard it was. She'd mistaken the control for strength. Some of it was just rigidity, and rigidity is its own cost. Her sister asked if there was anything she'd undo. She sat with that for a moment. She said no. Not because what happened to her was acceptable. Not because the 2 years were something she'd have chosen, but because of what she'd built during them and what she'd learned about herself in the building. She'd done something hard for a long time and done it well, and she'd come out of it with a life that was specifically, precisely, entirely hers. Not inherited, not defaulted into. Built. She knew the difference. She knew it in a way you can only know it from a specific direction. Her sister said, "That makes sense for you." It did. The last thing she told me was something she'd been turning over for a while and hadn't quite been able to articulate until recently. She said she'd spent some time, in the early months after leaving, wondering if the 2 years had been necessary. Whether she could have just left when she first knew, with less in place, and been fine. She probably would have been fine. Her income was solid. She had people. The practical situation wasn't so precarious that a faster exit would have left her stranded. So why hadn't she done it that way? She thought about it for a long time, and the answer she arrived at was this. It wasn't about logistics. It was about proof. Not proof to show anyone else. Proof to herself. Proof that she could do the long, steady, careful thing. That she could build something under difficult conditions over a sustained period of time. That her assessment of herself, as someone capable, resourceful, clear-eyed under pressure, was accurate. The 2 years was that proof. She would have been fine without it. But she would have walked away without knowing what she now knew, which was that she could do what she'd done. That it was in her. That when everything went wrong, she didn't fall apart or explode or hand the outcome to someone else. She built, quietly, for 2 years. And then she left on her own terms, at a time of her choosing, into a life she'd already constructed. That knowledge has a value that's hard to price. She's in the new city still. Different job, same work. She went independent about a year after arriving, and it suited her in ways the structure never had. She has good people around her. She's seeing someone carefully, specifically, with a clarity about what she needs, and what she won't compromise on. That comes from having once compromised on everything without knowing she was doing it. She told me she was okay. And the way she said it had the particular quality of someone who means it without performing it, who has been not okay for long enough that okay feels specific and real rather than default. I asked her if she had anything she'd want someone to hear who was in something like what she'd been in. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You probably already know. That's the thing nobody tells you. By the time you're asking the question, you usually already know the answer. The hard part isn't figuring it out. The hard part is deciding what you're going to do with what you know." She looked out the window. She said, "And you're more capable of doing it than you think. The building, whatever your version of the building is, you can do it. People can do hard things for a long time when the thing on the other side of it is worth it." She paused. She said, "And it's worth it. I promise you it's worth it." Then she went back to her coffee, and the conversation moved on to other things, and she seemed, sitting there in the afternoon light of a city she'd chosen, like someone who had come a very long way from a very difficult place and knew it and wasn't making a production of knowing it. Just a person. In her life. Present in it. That's the whole story. Comment below if any of it stayed with you. Even a word is enough. Subscribe. Next video is already written. See you there.